The temperature was closing in on a hot 90 degrees Fahrenheit in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as Ray Brennan pulled open the heavy glass door of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel on July 21, 1976. But the heat outside was the last thing on Ray's mind. He was just excited to be here at the Pennsylvania Convention of the American Legion, the nation's biggest veterans group. Ray, a retired Air Force captain, was now back among his people. Ray was 61 years old, and he had never married, but in some ways, he was married to the Air Force. His career spanned more than 2 decades, from the eve of World War II until 1960, when heart troubles forced him to retire. He never saw combat, but he helped save lives by running hospitals for wounded airmen in the Korean War. Ray walked a little taller when he was at these conventions. He knew that to an outsider, this gathering of more than 4,000 Legionnaires might look like a bunch of older men and women with graying hair, a lot of them wearing uniforms that didn't fit quite as well as they used to. But Ray knew that the people in the huge marble lobby in front of him were the everyday heroes who had risked their lives serving their country from World War II to the Vietnam War. And Ray was one of them. To all these veterans, he was Captain Ray Brennan, bookkeeper for American Legion Post Number 42 in Towanda, Pennsylvania. As Ray straightened his shoulders and began his first round of handshakes with old friends, he felt a twinge of regret. Ray knew that if he had not had that second heart attack in 1960, he'd still be on active military duty until mandatory retirement at 64 years old. Still trim and fit, Ray was sure he still had what it took to wear the uniform. But Ray gave himself a shake to snap out of it. He knew he had a good life. Even his years out of the military were not so bad. A passionate seashell collector, Ray had been asked by the Smithsonian Institution to help organize the National Shell Collection. He even got a seashell named after him. And anyway, Ray had been looking forward to this convention for months, and now that he was actually here, he didn't want to waste time regretting the past. For the next 3 days, Ray had a great time, telling stories, listening to speeches, and catching up with people he loved over dinner and drinks. Then, on July 24th, he made the 180-mile drive back home to Towanda, a town of 3,000 people near the New York border. 2 days after he had returned from the convention, Ray was sitting in his kitchen, still talking about the convention to his sister, Maisie Travis, when suddenly, Ray stopped talking mid-sentence and clutched his chest. He had the shooting pain that felt almost like it was burning, and it left Ray breathless and struggling to keep from falling out of his chair. His sister, Maisie, dropped her newspaper and grabbed her brother by the arm to steady him, and she said she would call Ray's doctor right away. But Ray really didn't want the help. He was terrified of having another heart attack, but this pain, it just felt different. It felt like his heart was just racing. He was sure it would just pass. Shuffling slowly into the living room, Ray collapsed into his favorite armchair, and he told his sister that he was just worn out from all the socializing and eating too much rich food and staying up too late swapping war stories, and that he really just needed to close his eyes and let this thing pass. And before long, Ray fell asleep. But when he woke up from his nap, Maisie could tell that Ray was worse, not better. His face was pale, and it was getting harder for him to breathe. By the afternoon, he was literally gasping for breath, which really frightened Maisie. So Maisie sat down next to him in his armchair and insisted that he go to a hospital. Ray still hated the idea, but his breathing was getting so labored that he was getting scared too, and so he reluctantly agreed. They slowly walked out to her car, and then after getting inside, Maisie drove him to a hospital in the next town over. When they arrived, a nurse immediately placed an oxygen mask over Ray's nose and mouth. Then she took his temperature and saw that he was running a fever of 102 degrees Fahrenheit. The nurse helped Ray onto a gurney and wheeled him into the emergency room for more tests, which would include chest x-rays. Ray felt grateful that he could just lie down. A little while later, Maisie stood at Ray's bedside and held his hand as an emergency room doctor walked in with a very concerned look on his face. The x-ray they had taken showed that Ray had a dangerous buildup of fluid in his lungs. That's why Ray was gasping for breath. The doctor asked Maisie to please step out for a moment, and then once she had, the doctor told Ray that he was going to drain the fluid in his lungs himself. The doctor helped Ray sit up and lowered his gown to expose his ribcage, and then the doctor grabbed a long hollow needle from a nearby instrument tray. Ray winced in pain as the doctor inserted that long needle between Ray's ribs and into the space around his lungs. And then soon, the doctor was using that needle to suction out some of the fluid, relieving the pressure Ray was feeling. And for a few minutes after this procedure, Ray breathed a lot easier. But it didn't last. Within a half hour, Ray was gasping again and spitting up pinkish foam from deep inside of his lungs. The doctor drained the fluid again and again, but each time the liquid came right back. The doctor had never seen anything like it. It was almost like Ray was drowning in his own fluids. The doctor explained to Maisie that her brother's heart condition had already weakened him, and now his respiratory system was crashing and there was little doctors could do if they couldn't remove the fluid. His condition would only get worse. And so the doctor told Maisie that he did not think Ray would live much longer. Maisie choked back tears as the thought of losing her sweet-natured brother sunk in. Ray had always been so careful of his health ever since his heart problems forced him to retire young. How could he now be at death's door? Less than a week later, and 80 miles away, Dr. Ernest Campbell stood in an examination room in Bloomsburg Hospital. His patient, a 48-year-old World War II veteran named Sam Morris, was running a high fever and having difficulty swallowing. Dr. Campbell feared that Sam might have typhoid fever, a brutal and extremely rare disease that often comes from swallowing sewage-contaminated water. Campbell had seen a lot of this disease when he was working for the Peace Corps in Kenya, but it was almost unheard of in the United States. The doctor asked Sam what he'd been doing prior to getting sick, and Sam would say that he had attended a convention in Philadelphia, and while he was there, he suffered a terrible headache and decided to come home early. As he spoke, Sam mentioned that 2 other veterans who'd attended the same convention had also been admitted to Bloomsburg Hospital. In fact, he'd seen one of them being wheeled past his room. Maybe they should be checked out too, Sam suggested. Dr. Campbell paused for a moment, wondering if there might be a link between the 3 men's illnesses. After he finished examining Sam, the doctor looked up the other 2 veterans. He found that they all had very similar symptoms, and one of the men, an 82-year-old widower named Bill Baird, was even sicker than Sam. It was all but impossible for all 3 men to have typhoid fever. Campbell knew something else, maybe something doctors had never even seen before, was preying on these men. Dr. Campbell consulted with the other men's doctors and ordered the same tests for all 3 veterans. The lab promised they would get the results back as soon as possible. But before the results came back, the elderly veteran, Bill, got worse. No matter what Dr. Campbell tried, Bill's lungs kept filling up with bloody foam. Dr. Campbell felt powerless as he watched his patient's life drain away. And then early on the morning of Friday, July 30th, Bill died. He'd only been in the hospital for a couple of days. Later that day, Dr. Campbell was back in his office, trying to figure out how to treat the 2 remaining veterans in his care. He was just thankful that the 2 patients were younger and stronger than Bill had been. He hoped their bodies would be able to fight off the disease on their own. While Dr. Campbell looked over their charts, a nurse knocked on his door. She had the veterans' test results. Dr. Campbell eagerly grabbed them from her, desperate for any indication of what he was fighting. But as he looked the results over, Dr. Campbell's hope drained away. The results were inconclusive. There was nothing telling him how he could treat this mystery disease. Dr. Campbell realized he was not capable of tackling this disease on his own. Whatever had infected the veterans was extremely deadly. If it was contagious, it could be the start of a massive epidemic. He put down the test results, then picked up the phone and quickly dialed the number for the federal health authorities. He knew he had to get through and tell someone before this situation got even worse. Dr. Campbell had barely put the phone down before the news media began to hear rumors about a mysterious disease that seemed to be striking veterans who attended this American Legion conference in Philadelphia. The COVID pandemic was decades in the future, but even then, the public was anxious about the possibility of a disease that could spread wildly, potentially killing millions of people. The Chicago Tribune newspaper compared this Philadelphia outbreak to a popular movie at the time, The Andromeda Strain, that imagines a disease from outer space that comes to a small town on Earth and sets off a tidal wave of sickness and death. And so after that news story broke, Doctors all across the country started getting all these calls from patients reporting respiratory symptoms and wondering if they too had the mystery disease. Many did not. They just had chest colds, but their panicky calls jammed up the emergency lines from coast to coast. 3 days after Dr. Campbell called for help, Dr. David Sensor rushed through the front doors of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. The CDC was home to the world's foremost disease detectives, with a mission to prevent outbreaks both in the United States and also abroad. The 51-year-old head of the agency, Dr. Sensor, had gotten word over the weekend of an emerging health crisis in Pennsylvania. Dr. Campbell at Bloomsburg Hospital was one of the first people who had called it in. The CDC took Campbell's call very seriously, especially as a flood of other calls about sick veterans around the state poured in. Despite the early hour, the building was buzzing with activity. Phones were ringing off the hook, and staff were running around passing documents to each other. Dr. Sensor reached his office, where several senior officials were waiting for him. He sat down at his desk, and they briefed him on everything they had learned. Over the weekend, a mysterious epidemic had spread like wildfire. So far, the agency knew that a total of 37 people throughout Pennsylvania had been hospitalized with headaches, chest pains, fever, and lung congestion. 13 of them had died. Dr. Sensor rubbed his forehead and let the information sink in. He asked if they'd made any progress on identifying the cause of the disease, but everyone in the room just shook their heads. They didn't even know if this disease was caused by a bacteria, a virus, or something else. The only thing they knew was that almost everyone who got sick had attended that Veterans Conference at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel from July 21st to the 24th. But this clue only raised more questions. Not everyone who was sick had actually been inside of that hotel. A bus driver from Western Pennsylvania who had simply dropped passengers off in front of the hotel and a female bank teller who worked across the street from the hotel had both died that morning. Neither of them had entered the hotel or participated in the conference, but they both shared the exact same symptoms as the veterans. Dr. Sensor frowned. He knew there was no way this was a coincidence. If other people had contracted the disease by just being near this hotel, it meant that whatever was infecting people was highly contagious. An outbreak like this could be catastrophic. His thoughts of a worst-case scenario were interrupted when another health officer walked into his office. This officer had just talked to a representative from the veterans group that had hosted this now infamous convention. Another man had apparently just died. Now 14 people were dead from this mystery illness. The officer handed Dr. Sensor several autopsy reports, and as he read them, Dr. Sensor's face drained of color. The reports described the victim's lungs as being covered in a thick, bacteria-filled layer that looked like Brillo pads. This layer prevented some antibiotics from penetrating the lungs, which made it very difficult to treat this infection. And so, with medicine basically unable to help fight this disease, the victim's only slim hope was for their own bodies to somehow overcome the attack on their own. Dr. Sensor looked up at all the people gathered in his office, and he wasted no time telling them what to do. They had to get a team of scientists to Philadelphia as soon as possible and find out what was killing so many people. That evening, one of the CDC's senior investigators, a 32-year-old man named Dr. Fraser, broke through a gauntlet of reporters posted in front of the CDC headquarters. They shouted questions at him, but Dr. Fraser kept his head down and walked past all of them. He didn't have any answers yet, and he didn't want to give out any wrong information. But he hoped that would change soon. Dr. Fraser was going to lead 20 members of the CDC's Epidemic Intelligence Service to investigate this outbreak. This would be one of the most intensive searches for the cause of a mass outbreak in world history. Whatever the disease was, it was moving fast. In the few hours since Dr. Sensor had ordered Dr. Fraser to assemble a team, 10 more people had died and 39 more were seriously ill. Dr. Fraser met Dr. Sensor in a quickly assembled war room filled with photos and maps of the area and victims, nearly all of them being military veterans. After Dr. Sensor gave him an update, Dr. Fraser outlined his plan for the investigation. He would lead one team in Philadelphia, collecting samples from the hotel, while another team would travel throughout Pennsylvania, interviewing patients who had been hospitalized with this disease. He was confident that they would be able to figure out any common patterns between the various patients and find whatever was causing this. Dr. Sensor agreed that this was the best approach, and so he shook Dr. Fraser's hand, wished him luck, and sent him home to pack. The next day, Dr. Fraser and his team of investigators wore gloves and protective masks as they entered the grand lobby of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel. Just 2 weeks earlier, it had been packed with veterans and their families. Today, it was nearly empty, except for a few startled-looking staff members. Dr. Fraser figured that nobody wanted to stay at this hotel until the cause of the outbreak was identified. The investigators' footsteps rang out on the marble floor as they walked to the reception desk and explained their mission: to gather physical evidence inside of this hotel that could be tested for the disease. The team went to work. Dr. Fraser instructed them to gather samples from every surface and object in the hotel. Then he reached into his satchel and pulled out a small plastic test tube. He unscrewed the top, which held a cotton swab soaked in a special solution. He carefully rubbed the swab on the reception desk and then placed it back into the test tube and labeled it. He wasn't going to overlook anything. Throughout the lobby, the EIS investigators were doing the same thing. One of them was on his hands and knees, painstakingly swabbing different sections of carpet. Another woman pulled off air conditioning grates to check the vents. Once they were done in the lobby, Dr. Fraser and his team went through every location in the hotel that had been used by the veterans during this convention. They swabbed door handles, elevator buttons, and furniture. They moved through the hotel's kitchens and bars, swiping the insides of water pitchers, coffee pots, and silverware. They collected bits of food and the ashes from the bottom of ashtrays. And then several hours later, Dr. Fraser led a team up to the roof of the hotel, 20 stories above the city. The hot August sun beat down on all of them as they scraped up bird droppings next to a large cooling tank. Dr. Fraser thought that sick pigeons might have carried the virus and maybe somehow transmitted it to the veterans, and so that's why they had to check the droppings. A little while later, the team was relieved to return to the cool lobby of the hotel. They sealed their samples in a container to be sent back to the laboratory for examination. The answer to what caused the deadly disease had to be somewhere inside one of those test tubes. Once the samples were collected, they were sent straight to the CDC's lab in Atlanta. Dr. Sensor had assembled some of the country's best scientists to test them for every disease imaginable. One of those scientists was a young microbiologist named Joseph McDade. Dr. McDade specialized in animal-borne illnesses, and it was his job to test for rare diseases such as Q fever, which could be transmitted from farm animals like goats, sheep, and cattle. So far, there wasn't any evidence that the veterans had interacted with any of those animals, but Dr. Sensor didn't want to take any chances. Unfortunately, Dr. McDade couldn't just look at the samples under a microscope and see if the bacteria that caused Q fever was present. There would be too many other microscopic organisms present. Instead, he had to isolate the bacteria and get a big enough sample to examine. It was an absurdly drawn-out process. First, Dr. McDade had to take lung tissue from someone who died from the mystery disease, inject it into the abdomen of a guinea pig, and then wait for 2 weeks. If the animal developed a fever, that likely meant it had Q fever. Dr. McDade thought Q fever was a long shot, but he agreed with Dr. Sensor that it was important to rule out every possible disease. So he went ahead and started the testing process. And much to his surprise, the guinea pig did come down with a fever, but it came down with it after only 2 days, which meant this disease wasn't Q fever, it was something worse. But when he looked at the samples under the microscope, Dr. McDade saw nothing. Except for a few scattered bacteria, the sample was completely clean. Just to be sure, he repeated the process, testing for other types of bacteria, but nothing showed up. Dr. McDade assumed that whatever was causing the guinea pig's fever was not a bacteria, but figuring out what it really was landed outside of his expertise. And so he passed along his results to Dr. Sensor, hoping someone else could make more sense of it. If they didn't, he wasn't sure how they'd solve the deadly infection. But over the next few weeks, no answer emerged. On August 20th, 1976, so almost 3 weeks after the first cases of this mystery disease were reported, CDC head Dr. Sensor sat in his office in Atlanta. He looked at the inconclusive test results that were spread across his desk. Despite the CDC's best efforts, they weren't any closer to solving this mystery. Dr. Sensor had other teams scour over Dr. McDade's guinea pig's bacteria samples, but nothing out of the ordinary had appeared. David Fraser's samples from the Bellevue Stratford Hotel had also revealed nothing, and they had conducted extensive interviews with patients to check for commonalities, but those interviews had not offered any new clues either. Although they'd been able to rule out certain diseases like typhoid, the plague, and miscellaneous viruses, they were no closer to figuring out what was causing this outbreak. Aside from a few bacteria that naturally occurred in the environment, they had found no evidence of anything unusual. And in the meantime, people kept getting sick. All told, 226 people had been infected by this mystery disease, and the death toll had now climbed to 34. The public was getting more scared by the day. An assistant brought in a stack of newspapers and magazines. Dr. Sensor groaned when he saw the headlines. An article from Time magazine called the disease, quote, the Philadelphia killer, end quote. The CDC's inability to provide an answer to the terrifying illness only fueled people's fears, and some began to turn to conspiracy theories. Dr. Sensor eyed the thick stack of pink messages on his desk. The CDC had been flooded with calls ever since the investigation began. People from all over the country phoned in with questions, tips, and general panic. Some wondered if it was an attack from a foreign adversary. Even the FBI had called. While there was no sign it was an act of bioterrorism, it couldn't be completely ruled out either, and that made people nervous. Dr. Sensor couldn't blame them. But after launching the largest medical field investigation in its history, they had hit a brick wall. There were no more samples to test, either from the hotel or from sick patients. David Fraser's team in Philadelphia had done everything they could to investigate the outbreak. The only silver lining was that the number of people becoming ill had abruptly stopped, which meant this mystery illness was not transmissible from person to person, and so the general population was not in any danger of a massive pandemic. But Dr. Sensor didn't take much comfort from that. Without knowing what was behind this disease, there'd be no way to stop it if it happened again. Still, he was out of ideas. Dr. Sensor let out a deep breath and picked up the phone to call Dr. Fraser. It was now, unfortunately, time to call off the investigation. Five months later, in December of 1976, Joseph McDade, the microbiologist who had conducted the Q fever tests, poured himself a drink at a holiday party in Atlanta. Dr. McDade was ready for the year to end. The past few months had been deeply frustrating. Ever since the investigation had been called off in August, Dr. McDade and his colleagues at the CDC had been under severe scrutiny. The head of the CDC, Dr. David Sensor, had even been accused by Congress of running a sloppy investigation. Public confidence in the health organization was at an all-time low, and Dr. McDade didn't know how they could get anyone to trust them again. As Dr. McDade chatted with some friends, someone tapped him so hard on the shoulder that he almost spilled his drink. Dr. McDade turned around and saw that it was one of his neighbors. The man was red in the face and he was holding a glass of whiskey in his hand, and so Dr. McDade could tell, this guy was drunk. But before he could say anything, the neighbor jabbed Dr. McDade in the chest with his other finger and said he knew Dr. McDade worked for the CDC. Then the neighbor ranted about how badly the CDC had failed the American people, and that people like him, Dr. McDade, were why the Philly killer had claimed so many lives. Dr. McDade took a step back, totally stunned, and then before he could respond, the neighbor had turned and walked away. Dr. McDade turned back around to his friends, but he couldn't focus on the conversation anymore. He wasn't angry at the confrontation. The man had been harsh, but he was right. Dr. McDade felt an overwhelming sense of failure for not being able to help crack the case. For the rest of the week, that feeling of failure stayed with Dr. McDade until he couldn't take it anymore. One day during the week between Christmas and New Year's, Dr. McDade headed to his lab at the CDC. No one else was there. Dr. McDade stood alone in a dark room surrounded by lab tables and microscopes. A string of blinking lights on the ceiling and a half-empty gift basket were the only reminders that it was the holidays. Dr. McDade wanted to look at the tissue samples again from Philadelphia just to kind of clear his conscience and make sure he didn't miss anything. So he pulled out the samples that he'd tested back in August and he slid them one by one under the lens of his microscope. And once again, they were completely clean, except for a few stray bacteria shaped like little rods. Over the summer, he'd assumed these stray bacteria had accidentally gotten mixed into the samples. It was impossible to avoid some level of contamination. Now, Dr. McDade wasn't so sure and wondered if there was more to them. He grabbed a few more slides from deep storage that he hadn't examined before, but they all looked the same. There were just a few rod-shaped bacteria floating around in each sample. But then, Dr. McDade examined one last slide from the lung tissue of a deceased veteran. And when he looked at it, he saw something that shocked him to his core. There weren't just a few of the rod-shaped bacteria. There was a giant cluster of them, far too many to be random contaminants. The answer had been in front of him the entire time. These little rod-shaped bacteria that he had written off had caused the outbreak. But before he could tell anyone, he had to be 100% sure he was right. So Dr. McDade grabbed more slides from the freezer and started running more tests. 2 weeks later, in January of 1977, Dr. Sensor sat in his office, eager to hear what Joseph McDade had apparently discovered during the holiday break. And Dr. McDade would announce that he had identified the actual organism responsible for the outbreak. He described his findings to Dr. Sensor, who was totally stunned. They had tested for every disease they could think of, but even the CDC's top minds could never have guessed it would be something like this. Dr. Sensor agreed that Dr. McDade's discovery was a significant breakthrough, but they needed to gather more samples from the Bellevue Stratford Hotel just to be certain. And so, a few days later, Dr. Sensor sent out one more team of medical detectives to Philadelphia. And during this search, the crew went straight to the roof of the hotel, and there they took a sample from a very specific area. And there, on a cold winter day 6 months after it first started, the mystery was finally solved. The Veterans Convention had taken place in July, a hot and sticky month in Philadelphia. The hotel's cooling system ran full blast for the 3 days of the convention. The cooling towers up on the roof were old and hadn't been maintained recently, allowing the water inside that was used for air conditioning to grow warm and stagnant. It had created the perfect environment for new bacteria to thrive, in a thin coating of slime commonly known as pond scum. Normally, the bacteria in pond scum doesn't make people sick, because people don't inhale it. That's why you can usually swim in lakes, ponds, and other freshwater sources without coming down with this particular deadly disease. It's only deadly if it becomes aerosolized, which means being turned into a spray. And in the summer of 1976, that's exactly what happened. When the hotel's air conditioning system kicked on, the bacteria, which had grown in the cooling tower's warm water, was transported down through the system's pipes. It was then sprayed out as cooled air all over the thousands of veterans inside the hotel. Everyone who inhaled the air at the convention was breathing in bacteria-ridden water droplets. That included people like the bus driver and bank teller who had both died. They hadn't even gone into the hotel, but they had been exposed to the infected mist that had come off the cooling tower and fell onto the sidewalk below. Not everyone who inhaled the mist got sick, including most of the hotel's employees and other guests. This was likely because they were younger or did not have any other health risks that made them more susceptible to this bacteria. Now, nobody knew about this deadly mist because right after the convention, the air conditioning filters at the hotel had been cleaned. That's why the team of EIS investigators didn't find bacteria when they scoured the hotel for samples. But after Joseph McDade's discovery, they finally tested the cooling tank's interior, which had been missed before when they were doing all those samples. In the slime coating on the inside of the tower, they found the deadly bacteria that Dr. McDade had originally seen under his microscope. This bacteria was named Legionella in reference to the convention's attendees, the mostly male veterans who were all members of the American Legion. The condition they developed is now known as Legionnaire's disease, and while there are still occasional outbreaks today, Thanks to the efforts of the CDC, Joseph McDade, and even the angry neighbor at the holiday party, this disease is now treatable and much less fatal. But that all came too late for Captain Ray Brennan, the conference attendee who had to retire early from the service because of his heart issues. Surrounded by his 2 brothers and 4 sisters, including Maisie, Ray died just before sunrise on July 27, 1976, holding one of his beloved seashells in his right hand. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but he went down in history as the first of the 29 victims of Legionnaire's disease. It was a chilly morning on September 15, 2007. A sheep farmer named Gregorio Yaruri sat on his porch, sipping a mug of coffee and looking at the distant mountain peaks that surrounded his hometown of Carancas, a small village in southern Peru. It was silent except for the sheep bleating in the pasture. Then Gregorio heard a low sound, like a hum. At first, the noise was faint, and it sounded like it was coming from miles away. Then the hum grew louder, and the coffee in his mug started to vibrate. A moment later, pebbles on the ground surrounding his porch began to shake as the hum turned into a roar. Alarmed, Gregorio set down his mug and leaped down into the yard. He looked around, trying to figure out if the noise was human-made or maybe an earthquake. He covered his ears as the hum roared to a deafening scream. Then he spotted something small and orange streaking through the sky. An instant later, a sonic boom whipped across the valley, shattering a window in Gregorio's house. He was thrown onto his back and he rolled a few times before steadying himself in the dirt. Noises began to erupt all across the plain. Gregorio could hear dogs howling and shouts coming from some of the neighboring farms. Gregorio was bracing himself for something else to happen, but the sky above him was bright blue again. So he stood up, feeling totally shell-shocked, as he brushed the dust from his pants. He scanned the horizon for some clue as to what had caused this explosion. In the distance, he could see a plume of thick black smoke rising 100 feet into the air. At first, Gregorio was filled with dread. Then, a sense of determination swelled up inside of him. He needed to know what had just fallen from the sky. He ran for the bicycle he kept leaning up against the side of his house. He brushed the glass shards from his broken window off the seat, and then he hopped on and he set his feet on the pedals and took off towards the tower of smoke. As Gregorio neared the site of impact, the smell of rotten eggs stung the inside of his nostrils. He pulled over just long enough to grab his bandana out of his back pocket and tie it around his face to block the smell. About 100 feet from the tower of smoke, he noticed red dust covering the ground. The closer he got, the thicker the blanket of dust seemed to be. When he finally reached the base of the smoke plume, he rubbed the dust with his feet. It appeared to be clay that had been kicked up by the crash. The smoke was so thick, he still couldn't tell what had impacted the ground. But whatever it was, it had created what appeared to be a huge crater in the ground. The column of smoke was emerging from a hole about 50 feet across. It really looked like someone had just detonated a bomb there. A few minutes later, the smoke started thinning out, and Gregorio could finally see into this crater. He walked up to the edge, and his eyes widened from a combination of fear and wonder. The crater was filled with a dark green liquid. The liquid had a consistency somewhere between maybe water and sludge, and it was bubbling as if it was simmering. Gregorio pinched his nose through the bandana. The egg smell coming off of this crater was so strong that he felt sick to his stomach. He walked around the perimeter of the crater, kicking at the shards of clay and jagged rock that littered the ground. It looked like someone had smashed a huge vase to pieces. Gregorio scanned the horizon. It seemed like he was the only person who'd come to investigate this plume of smoke. He figured the neighboring farmers must be worried that whatever crashed into the ground was a bad omen. A lot of his neighbors still believed in ancient spirits. But after a while, it struck Gregorio as kind of odd that not even an emergency vehicle had come out to survey the scene. Something had just shot out of the sky and smashed into the earth. It felt like that was the kind of thing police would want to know about. But Gregorio knew help would not be coming from his village. Only about 250 people lived in Caracas, so it didn't have its own police force. The authorities were located in the nearby town of Desaguadero, which was about 7 miles up the road. Gregorio wasn't sure if the folks in Desaguadero would be able to see the smoke plume from there. If they couldn't, he worried that the authorities might not even know this happened. Gregorio jumped back on his bicycle and pedaled to the house of a neighbor who owned a motorcycle that Gregorio knew he'd be able to borrow. It was going to be up to him to raise the alarm, and he had to get out there fast. About 20 minutes later, Gregorio parked his borrowed motorcycle in front of the police station in Desaguadero and then walked inside. He was greeted by a tired-looking receptionist with the phone pressed to her ear. It seemed like she'd been talking to people for hours. 3 deputies were talking loudly about an airstrike. It took a minute for Gregorio to realize what was going on. The police did know about this explosion. One of them had seen the orange streak in the sky, but they thought that Caracas had actually been struck by a missile. Gregorio waved down one of the officers and explained he had seen a crater filled with this green ooze that smelled terrible. The officer disappeared into a back room for a moment, and then he returned with the chief of police. They asked if Gregorio could lead them to the crash site. Gregorio agreed. Soon, he was back on his neighbor's motorcycle, leading police cars along the 7-mile road back to the Caracas countryside. As the crash site came into view, Gregorio could see people moving around the rim of the crater. As he drew even closer, he realized that dozens of villagers from Caracas had come to see what had caused the smoke. He guessed that when the black plume of smoke had dissipated, the neighbors figured it was now safe to come take a look. Gregorio pulled over his motorcycle about 20 yards from the crater and dismounted. The police cars fanned out around him. As policemen approached the perimeter of the crater, Gregorio noticed his neighbors picking up rock fragments as souvenirs and pointing at the green liquid at the bottom of the massive hole. Gregorio overheard a nearby couple speculate that maybe this was the result of a missile strike from Peru's neighbor and rival, Chile. One teenage boy was talking excitedly, telling his friends they were probably just attacked by a UFO. An old woman, who Gregorio assumed was the boy's grandmother, told him to be quiet. This was clearly a sign of bad things to come, a curse sent by the spirits. She sounded terrified. Gregorio did not find any of these theories very convincing. However, he wasn't ready to offer any of his own. But the strange explosion had him just as curious as his neighbors. He picked up a shard of deep red rock near his feet and slipped it into his coat pocket, just as another car pulled onto the scene. Gregorio recognized the mayor of Caracas, Maximiliano Trujillo. Mayor Trujillo stepped out of the back seat, squinting in the sunlight. The mayor walked toward the crater, looking stunned. He stopped right next to Gregorio and asked what happened. Gregorio just shrugged, still in disbelief. Straight ahead of them, a pile of black rocks were smoking at the edge of the crater. The mayor's eyes widened when he saw them, and he began walking toward the crater to get a better look. By late afternoon, hundreds of people had gathered at the crash site. Gregorio stood near the front of the crowd, hoping that if he stuck around long enough, the police might announce what had caused this explosion. As the sun started to set, the smell of rotten eggs returned. It was faint, but pungent. Gregorio's eyes began to water. He pulled his bandana back up over his face, but that didn't work anymore. The smell was giving him a headache. A few minutes later, a short woman standing near Gregorio leaned over and began vomiting, and she wasn't the only one. People all around the crater were starting to get sick. Between the rotten smell coming off the green sludge and now the vomit, the air around the crater was now so thick that Gregorio thought he might faint. He fought his way through the crowd back to his motorcycle and sped off towards home, sucking in the fresh air as he went. When he walked through his front door, his phone was ringing. It was his son, who had moved about 6 hours away for a job after he had graduated school. As Gregorio told him about the afternoon's excitement, he took the rock out of his pocket and he laid it on the kitchen table. He began to describe its deep red color, but his son cut him off. He begged Gregorio not to touch it. If Carancas was attacked by a missile, then this red rock could very likely be radioactive. Gregorio remembered the people getting sick at the crater. He felt a surge of anxiety, and he covered the rock with a dish towel. If his son was right, half the town was now vulnerable, and Gregorio spent more time at the crater than anyone else. Panicked, he hung up on his son and ran outside to hose himself off. He didn't know how much it would help, but he had to do something. He spent the rest of the evening feeling totally anxious, until finally he managed to fall asleep. The next morning, Gregorio woke up with the sun as usual. He still felt a bit queasy, but no worse than the night before. He breathed a big sigh of relief, because he figured that radiation poisoning would have made him feel a lot sicker by now, and so probably he was in the clear. As the sunrise turned the sky a vivid pink, Gregorio walked out of his house towards the sheep pen. He grabbed tufts of hay and dried grass and scattered them on the ground, and the sheep came running over to graze. Gregorio watched until one of the sheep picked its head up and ambled away. Then he noticed something unusual. There were dark splotches on the hay right where the sheep's head had been. It took Gregorio a moment to realize what he was looking at. He walked over and grabbed the sheep that had ambled off, and he lifted its head up, and blood was trickling out of its nose. Then he looked at the ground. Another splotch of blood stained the hay beneath his feet. As he walked the length of the pen, he found drops of blood spattered all over the ground. Gregorio rushed inside and called his vet, expecting to leave a voicemail since it was still early, but to his surprise, the vet actually picked up. He sounded wide awake, like he'd already been up for hours. He said that he'd been getting calls all morning. Livestock across Carancas were getting sick. The vet promised to make Gregorio's farm his next stop. Gregorio thanked him and hung up. He had no idea what kind of sickness had emerged from that crater, but it seemed like it could be deadly. A few days after the crash, Mayor Trujillo walked between rooms at a health clinic. Every exam table had been turned into a makeshift hospital bed. More than 200 people who visited the crash site had flooded the hospital in Desaguadero. They were all sick with migraine headaches, and they were vomiting. The hospital got so overwhelmed with patients, they diverted people to smaller health clinics throughout the city, which were now acting as satellite operations. Mayor Trujillo had called the Red Cross to help administer care in these satellite clinics, but now even the clinics were completely full. The smell inside the packed clinic was terrible. People were retching and crying. To the mayor, it felt like he was walking through a war zone. Thankfully, he'd received confirmation that morning from the authorities in Lima, the capital of Peru, that Carancas had not been attacked by a missile. In fact, scientists said that the crater had been caused by a meteorite. Mayor Trujillo was relieved that they were not under attack, but a mystery remained. Nobody knew why people were now getting sick. Meteorites had never been known to have that kind of effect. Specialists were flying out from Lima to investigate further. Mayor Trujillo moved through the crowd of patients in the waiting room, trying his best to reassure them. He stopped by a Red Cross doctor who was tending to a small elderly woman on a folding chair. The mayor greeted the old woman and then thanked the doctor for traveling all this way to Desaguadero. The doctor stood upright, looking tired but hopeful. He explained that all the patients' blood work was coming back normal. He didn't know why they were sick, but judging from their symptoms, he said everyone should make a full recovery in a few days. Trujillo smiled with relief, but the old woman hissed and called the doctor a liar. Many of the patients around her nodded in agreement, eyeing the doctor like he was in on some big conspiracy. He heard them muttering about evil spirits causing this disaster. Trujillo knew that many villagers believed the meteorite was a curse from the ancient spirits, and because of that, many had refused to listen to the Red Cross doctors and aid workers. To Trujillo, this was the problem with people of the Carancas region. Outsiders never came to the area, so many of the villagers didn't trust them. Trujillo knew that Carancas was not cursed. He just needed to find a way to get his people to listen. Then an idea struck. maybe he could get them to believe the science with the help of someone who could appease the spirits. Trujillo left the health clinic, climbed into his car, and drove the 7 miles to Caracas. The small village, nestled in the shadows of snow-capped mountains, was eerily quiet and deserted. As the mayor slowly drove through the narrow and winding streets, he could see people peering out their windows. Normally, they'd come outside to wave hello, but now it seemed like they were terrified of leaving their homes. A few minutes later, Trujillo pulled up to a small adobe house with a thatched roof. It belonged to the local shaman, a man the mayor had long respected for his wisdom. Everybody in town trusted the shaman, and Trujillo hoped he could bring some calm to the community. Trujillo stepped out of his car, and he was pleased to see that the shaman came out of his house to greet him. Trujillo explained the situation to the shaman, and the shaman nodded thoughtfully, and he agreed that the meteorite was not a curse, although it had disrupted balance in the land. And so he said he was happy to do his part to restore the natural order of things. Trujillo smiled and shook the shaman's hand. He promised he'd be in touch soon, and then Mayor Trujillo headed back to his car. With the shaman's help, he was sure he could get the townspeople to listen to him and restore order in the town. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Montreal, Canada, a professor named Peter Schultz was standing in line at a coffee shop scrolling through the news app on his phone. He taught Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Brown University in Rhode Island, but he was in Montreal for a conference on craters made by meteorites and other space objects. He was fascinated by the articles about the meteorite strike in southern Peru, and not just because he found meteorites in general interesting. This one stuck out because it made no sense. The reports said that Caracas was struck by a chondrite meteorite, the most common type of meteorite, but also the most fragile. A chondrite meteorite is a type of rock that comes from asteroids. They're made up of small grains of minerals that have not been melted or changed much since they formed billions of years ago. Chondrites are so porous that they crack and burn up in Earth's atmosphere before they can hit the ground. To Peter, it seemed impossible that one of these chondrite meteorites could hit the Earth with enough force to create this massive crater. Stranger still, he had read that more than 200 people who visited the crash site had ended up in the hospital. Meteorites should not be making people sick. Peter thought there had to be more to the story than met the eye. Peter turned his phone to silent and spent the rest of the afternoon in back-to-back lectures at his conference. He finally left around dusk. As he walked to dinner, he noticed his voicemail was full of inquiries from different reporters and news outlets, hoping for a comment from him on how a meteorite could cause such a widespread sickness. But Peter had to tell these reporters the truth. He did not have answers, but he wanted to get them, and the only way to do it was to head to Peru and see the crater for himself. A few days later, Mayor Trujillo stood in the very crowded community center in Desaguadero. He had needed a huge space to hold this town hall meeting, and Caracas didn't really have a building that could accommodate this size crowd. Even this community center was packed with almost every single person from Caracas in attendance. The mayor shivered, but not because he was cold. He knew that the government scientists had discovered something that would have a profound impact on everyone in this area, and not just for those who had gotten sick at the crater. As Trujillo stood there waiting, he spotted Gregorio Yaruri sitting in the back. He was grateful to him for his role in alerting the authorities, and was happy to see that Gregorio looked healthy. In fact, most of the locals who'd gotten sick were starting to feel better. But Trujillo knew if they didn't listen to the scientists, then things could get worse again. Trujillo had invited 2 guests to this meeting. One was the local shaman, and the other was a geologist named Luisa Macedo. She was one of the scientists flown in by the government. The mayor made his way to the front of the crowd and called for silence. He had to choose his words carefully to avoid panicking those who believed that Caracas was actually cursed. He cleared his throat and announced that, yes, something had fallen from the sky, but it had been a meteorite from outer space. Before anyone could argue with him, he called the shaman over to join him and asked if he could prepare a sacrifice. It needed to be something that would appease the spirits in case they were the ones who sent the meteorite crashing to Earth. The shaman nodded. He told the crowd that they had rightfully sensed that the meteorite had unbalanced the land, but he reassured them that the correct sacrifice would help appease any unhappy spirits. He promised he would sacrifice a llama fetus at the crater as soon as possible, which should be enough to restore harmony to the area. Several of the older women present smiled, but Mayor Trujillo was still tense. Now came the hard part, getting them to accept the scientists' findings without panicking. He introduced Luisa, the government geologist. The hall erupted in whispers. Trujillo told the villagers to calm down, that Luisa was from southern Peru just like they were. That's why he'd asked her to speak. Everyone seemed to accept this, since a regional scientist seemed a little more trustworthy. The crowd settled down a bit, and then Luisa smiled and she held up a large cardboard chart she'd made showing data on the local water table. Trujillo held his breath, worried she was making things more complicated. Instead, the crowd pushed in to get a better look at what she had. Luisa explained that she and her team weren't totally sure what was making so many people and livestock sick, but they had a strong theory. The day that she and her team had arrived in town, they'd gone to the crash site and collected samples from different parts of the area. They also tested the groundwater at the bottom of the crater. Mayor Trujillo saw Luisa hesitate for a moment and then continue. She said that her team found that the water contained dangerous levels of arsenic, a deadly poison. The crowd erupted in murmurs of alarm. As Trujillo looked around the room, he wasn't surprised by everyone's reaction. When he first heard Luisa's theory, he'd been stunned too. But he needed the crowd to listen. Their lives depended on what Luisa had to say. Trujillo raised his hands and called for order, and after a few seconds, the townspeople did quiet down, and he told them to continue to listen to Luisa. Luisa nodded, and then explained that when the meteorite hit Caracas, the shockwave caused the groundwater to heat up and vaporize. This caused the air to fill with a fine mist of arsenic vapor. Everyone who had gone to see the crater got sick because they had inhaled that vapor. After hearing what she had to say, the crowd became agitated again and started shouting questions. Mayor Trujillo saw Gregorio in the back, trying to be heard, and so Trujillo demanded everyone be quiet, and he pointed at Gregorio and asked him to speak. Gregorio, the sheep farmer, stood up and politely asked Luisa if that meant their drinking water was contaminated too. Luisa stayed silent for a moment. Trujillo could tell she was carefully thinking about what to say next. Finally, she nodded and said that although they did need to do more testing, it was very likely. In fact, most likely, their water supply had been contaminated for years, making the people less healthy and more vulnerable to deadly diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. And so until they knew for sure, Luisa advised the crowd to just drink bottled water. Gregorio was alarmed by what he heard, but he thanked her and sat down. Everyone else seemed totally stunned into silence by Luisa's explanation. First the meteor hit, making people sick. Now they learned their water was contaminated all along. Trujillo knew it was frightening, but at least they knew what they were dealing with. After answering more questions, Luisa wrapped up her remarks and walked off the stage. But as she headed toward him, Mayor Trujillo noticed that the scientist looked anxious. He pulled her aside and asked if everything was okay. Louisa shook her head and told him that something still didn't make sense. She was confident that the sickness had been caused by arsenic gas from the meteorite impact, but she had not actually proven that. No scientists had detected arsenic in the air around the crater. That was a theory. In fact, she didn't understand how the meteorite could have gotten hot enough to create this toxic arsenic vapor. Louisa explained that meteorites are usually freezing when they impact Earth, even though they may look like they're on fire. That's because space is extremely cold, with an average temperature of negative 454 degrees Fahrenheit. The friction caused by entering Earth's atmosphere would have heated it up a little bit, but not enough to boil water and turn it into a mist. Mayor Trujillo frowned. He now realized that even Louisa wasn't sure that her arsenic theory was right. And if she was wrong, then something else had made his people sick. Trujillo was troubled. But he had a more immediate challenge, making sure the local drinking water was safe. It was up to the scientists to figure out whether arsenic vapor or something else had caused the mass sickness. Until they figured it out, Trujillo knew he would not sleep well. A little over 2 months later, in December of 2007, Professor Peter Schultz arrived in Caracas to investigate the crash site. On a dry and sunny day, he drove through the winding roads of the rugged countryside until he reached the crater. Even though the rainy season had nearly filled it with water, he was struck by how massive it was. Peter had heard about Luisa Macedo's discovery of arsenic in the water. There was no debate that there was arsenic in the water itself, but so far, nobody had been able to explain how, or even if, arsenic got into the air. Until that was proven, there was still the possibility that some other chemical from the meteorite's impact had made everyone sick. If that was the case, the people of Caracas could still be in danger. Peter was determined to find the answer and make sure these people were safe. And over the next few weeks, he was able to slowly form a theory that connected all the dots. Usually, when chondrite meteorites shoot through the Earth's atmosphere, their fragile makeup causes them to shatter into hundreds of tiny pieces, which turn to ash long before they ever reach the Earth's surface. And that's what should have happened with this meteorite. Peter concluded that the Caracas meteorite survived its passage through the atmosphere because of its high speed and shallow entry angle. He believed that these factors, along with the heat from the Earth's atmosphere, caused the outer layers of the meteorite to melt and fuse back together. That made it dense enough to make it through the atmosphere, where it became superheated and unleashed the arsenic vapor once it hit the ground. All this meant that the people of Caracas were safe. It was the meteorite and not some other unidentified danger that heated up the arsenic-laced water and turned it into vapor. Thankfully, the damage caused by the meteorite's impact was not permanent. All the people who'd gotten sick, including Gregorio Yaruri, made a full recovery, and so did all the animals. Thanks to the research of Luisa Macedo and the other scientists, arsenic was detected in the drinking water, and nonprofit organizations have installed measures to make it safer. Even though the water is cleaner and the arsenic gas is long gone, the people of Caracas will always remember when, in a way, they were attacked by a UFO.